A young servant boy spots his employer's wife adding poison to her millionaire husband's meal. With seconds to spare, he must choose: stay quiet or risk everything to save a man's life with 4 crucial words. Don't eat that, sir. Welcome to Podcast Stories. I'm your host, Mark Johnson. If you love your family and love to listen to interesting stories like this, subscribe to our channel. And now, put your headphones on and let's dive into this story.
The gleaming kitchen of the Blackwood mansion stretched before Tyler like a modern cathedral. Stainless steel appliances worth more than his yearly salary lined the walls, and the marble countertops gleamed under crystal pendant lights. Tyler had already learned to move through this space like a ghost, invisible yet essential. He watched Chef Marcus prepare tonight's special dinner, his movements precise and practiced. The aroma of truffle-infused risotto and pan-seared duck breasts filled the air. Tyler's own lunch had been a humble sandwich, eaten quickly in the servants' quarters. Everything must be perfect tonight, Chef Marcus muttered, more to himself than to Tyler. Mrs. Blackwood specifically requested her husband's favorite dishes. Tyler nodded, arranging the Versace plates with careful precision. He'd been working at the mansion for 6 months now, grateful for the job that helped support his grandmother back home. The pay was good, and Mr. Blackwood was fair, if distant. Mrs. Blackwood, however, the kitchen door swung open with a soft whoosh. Samantha Blackwood glided in, her Louboutin heels clicking against the marble floor. She wore a black cocktail dress that probably cost more than Tyler's entire education fund. "How's everything coming along?" Her voice carried its usual honey-sweet tone, but something in it made Tyler's skin prickle. He'd noticed lately how that sweetness never quite reached her eyes. "Perfectly on schedule, Mrs. Blackwood," Chef Marcus assured her. "The risotto will be ready just as the guests arrive." "Excellent," she smiled, running a manicured finger along the counter. "And Tyler, dear, make sure Richard's place setting is perfect. You know how particular he can be." Tyler nodded, keeping his eyes lowered respectfully. "Yes, ma'am. I'll need a moment alone in the kitchen," she announced suddenly. "I have a special ingredient for Richard's dish, a family secret." Chef Marcus hesitated for just a moment before nodding. "Of course, Mrs. Blackwood. I'll check on the wine selection." He left, leaving Tyler to finish arranging the plates. "You too, Tyler," she said, her tone leaving no room for discussion. But Tyler didn't move fast enough. As he gathered his cleaning supplies, he caught a glimpse in the reflection of the steel refrigerator. Mrs. Blackwood reaching into her purse, withdrawing a small vial filled with white powder. His heart began to race. Surely she wasn't. He forced himself to move slower, pretending to organize the cleaning supplies. In the reflection, he watched her carefully tap the powder into one specific dish, the one meant for Mr. Blackwood's place setting. Tyler's hands began to shake. The powder dissolved instantly, leaving no trace. If he hadn't seen it with his own eyes, Tyler, her voice cut through his thoughts like a knife. "Is there something fascinating about those cleaning supplies?" He turned, meeting her gaze for a brief moment. Her eyes were cold, calculating, all pretense of warmth gone. "No, ma'am. Sorry, ma'am." He hurried out of the kitchen, his mind racing. The gravity of what he'd witnessed hit him like a physical blow. Mrs. Blackwood, the elegant socialite who hosted charity galas and spoke at women's empowerment events, had just poisoned her husband's food, and Tyler was the only witness. His grandmother's voice echoed in his head. "Boy, doing nothing in the face of evil makes you complicit." But what could he do? Who would believe a teenage servant over Mrs. Blackwood? He'd lose his job at best, face worse consequences at worst. The sounds of arriving guests filtered through from the main hall. Tyler stood in the service corridor, his heart pounding. He had minutes, perhaps seconds, to decide what to do. The weight of his knowledge pressed down on him like a physical burden. The dining room of the Blackwood mansion transformed into a showcase of wealth and power. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the 20-foot mahogany table, each place setting a masterpiece of fine china, sterling silver, and hand-pressed linens. Tyler moved efficiently between the guests, filling water glasses and placing bread baskets. New York's elite filed in, hedge fund managers, real estate moguls, and their impeccably dressed wives. The air filled with expensive perfume and carefully measured laughter. Tyler recognized some faces from business magazines. Jonathan Pierce, who'd just closed $1 billion deal, Sarah Chen, CEO of a tech empire, and James Morrison, Mr. Blackwood's longtime business partner. "The table looks spectacular," Mrs. Chen commented, adjusting her Cartier bracelet. "Samantha always outdoes herself." Tyler's stomach churned as he watched Mrs. Blackwood graciously accept compliments. She wore a practiced smile, making small talk about her recent charity gala. No one would suspect the vial in her purse or her earlier actions in the kitchen. The room hushed as Richard Blackwood made his entrance. At 45, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who'd built an empire from nothing. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, his Tom Ford suit immaculate. But what struck Tyler most was the genuine warmth in Mr. Blackwood's eyes when he looked at his wife. "Darling," Mr. Blackwood crossed the room, placing a gentle kiss on Mrs. Blackwood's cheek. "Everything looks perfect, as always." Tyler watched Mrs. Blackwood lean into her husband's kiss, her acting so convincing it made his blood run cold. "I had your favorite prepared," she said, touching his arm affectionately. "The duck breast with truffle risotto." "You spoil me," Mr. Blackwood smiled, taking his seat at the head of the table. Tyler's hands trembled slightly as he poured water into Mr. Blackwood's glass. The poisoned dish would be served soon. He observed Mrs. Blackwood from the corner of his eye. Her composure was remarkable, but he caught the slight tensing of her jaw, the way her fingers gripped her wine glass too tightly. The first course arrived, a delicate butternut squash soup. Tyler stood back, watching the choreographed dance of servers and guests. His mind raced through possibilities. He could accidentally spill something on Mr. Blackwood's main course, but Mrs. Blackwood would surely have another opportunity. He could try to speak to Mr. Blackwood privately, but when, and would he believe him? "Tyler," Mrs. Blackwood's voice cut through his thoughts. "Make sure everyone's wine glasses stay full. It's a celebration, after all." "Yes, ma'am," he responded automatically. "What are we celebrating?" "Richard's latest acquisition." She smiled, but her eyes remained cold. "He just bought out his biggest competitor. Always the victor, my husband." Tyler noticed something in her tone: bitterness, resentment. He remembered overhearing snippets of arguments over the past months, mostly about money and time. Mr. Blackwood worked constantly, building his empire, while Mrs. Blackwood spent lavishly, hosting parties, traveling. The second course arrived, and Tyler watched Chef Marcus's team serve perfectly plated salads. Only 2 more courses until the main dish. His pulse quickened as he realized time was running out. From his position near the wall, he could see every face at the table, the wealthy guests, laughing and dining, oblivious to the drama unfolding around them. Mr. Blackwood discussed business with Mr. Morrison, while Mrs. Blackwood charmed the guest to her left, her performance flawless. But Tyler saw what others missed: the slight tremor in her hand as she lifted her wine glass, the way her eyes kept darting to the kitchen doors, the barely perceptible sheen of sweat on her upper lip. She was nervous, despite her composed exterior. The salad plates were cleared, and Tyler knew the poisoned main course would be next. His grandmother had raised him to believe that character revealed itself in moments of crisis. Right now, his character was being tested in ways he'd never imagined. A memory from 2 weeks ago flashed through Tyler's mind as he refilled water glasses. He'd been dusting the study's bookshelf when he overheard Mrs. Blackwood's heated phone conversation. "He's running everything into the ground," she'd hissed into her phone, unaware of Tyler's presence. "The Morrison deal was a disaster. We've lost millions, and he won't listen to reason." A pause. "No, divorce isn't an option. The prenup would leave me with nothing. There has to be another way." Now, watching the dinner party unfold, those words carried a sinister new meaning. Tyler moved mechanically around the table, his mind racing back through other moments he'd witnessed. Mrs. Blackwood's late-night meetings with unknown visitors, mysterious phone calls, and the sudden interest in her husband's life insurance policy she'd mentioned to her friend last week. The kitchen doors swung open as servers prepared to bring out the main course. Tyler's heart pounded against his ribs. His grandmother's face appeared in his mind. Madeline Johnson, who'd raised him after his parents' death, who worked 3 jobs to keep him in school, who taught him the difference between right and wrong. A man's character, Tyler, she would say, sitting in their small kitchen after a long day of cleaning houses, is what he does when no one else is looking. She'd taught him about integrity through example, returning extra change when cashiers made mistakes, helping neighbors even when they couldn't repay the favor. Just last Sunday, during their weekly phone call, she'd asked about his job at the mansion. "Are they treating you right, baby? Remember, no amount of money is worth losing your soul over." Tyler watched as Chef Marcus emerged with the first plate of the main course. The poisoned dish would be among them. His palms grew sweaty. The consequences of speaking up terrified him. He needed this job. His grandmother's medication wasn't cheap, and this position paid better than anything else he could find at 17. But the consequences of silence would be worse. He imagined Mr. Blackwood taking that first bite, imagined the poison taking effect. Could he live with himself, knowing he could have prevented a murder? Would he be complicit in the crime if he stayed quiet? Mrs. Blackwood caught his eye across the room and gave him a sharp look. She'd noticed his distraction. Tyler forced himself to continue his duties, pouring wine with trembling hands. He watched Mr. Blackwood laugh at something Mr. Morrison said, completely unaware that his wife had orchestrated his death to occur over dinner. The servers moved with practiced efficiency, placing the elegant plates before each guest. Tyler saw Mrs. Blackwood's slight nod as the poisoned plate was set before her husband. The duck breast was perfectly seared, the risotto creamy and aromatic, death disguised as dinner. Mr. Blackwood picked up his fork, and Tyler felt time slowed down. His grandmother's words echoed in his head. Do the right thing, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. He thought about the kind way Mr. Blackwood had treated him, giving him extra days off when his grandmother was sick, ensuring he got home safely after late events. The fork moved closer to Mr. Blackwood's lips. Tyler's world narrowed to this moment, this choice. His job, his future, his grandmother's security on one side, a man's life and his own conscience on the other. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a physical force. The dining room buzzed with conversation and the gentle clink of crystal glasses, but to Tyler, it felt like standing in the eye of a hurricane. Every sound seemed amplified. The scrape of forks against china, Mrs. Blackwood's too loud laugh, the shuffle of servers' feet against the hardwood floor. "Richard, darling," Mrs. Blackwood's voice carried across the table. "The chef prepared this specially for you. Your absolute favorite." Her words dripped with honey, but Tyler heard the poison beneath them. Mr. Blackwood smiled appreciatively, lifting his wine glass. "Then we should toast to good food, good friends, and my beautiful wife, who arranged this lovely evening." The guests raised their glasses in unison. Tyler, still clutching the wine bottle, remained frozen in place. He watched Mrs. Blackwood's perfectly manicured hand lift her glass, her red lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her free hand gripped the edge of the table, the only visible sign of her tension. "To success," she added, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hand, "and to new beginnings." The words sent a chill down Tyler's spine. New beginnings. For her, after her husband's death, the weight of the wine bottle in his hands felt suddenly heavy, like the weight of his conscience. Around the table, the guests began to eat. The aroma of truffle and herbs filled the air, masking any trace of the powder Mrs. Blackwood had added. Tyler watched in horror as Mr. Blackwood cut into his duck breast, the meat perfectly pink inside. "Samantha, you've outdone yourself this time," Mrs. Chen commented, savoring her meal. Everything is exquisite. Tyler's gaze darted between Mrs. Blackwood and her husband. She maintained her composure, but her eyes never left Mr. Blackwood's plate. She was waiting, watching, like a spider, observing its prey approach the web. Mr. Morrison launched into a story about their latest business deal, but Tyler barely heard the words. His focus remained fixed on Mr. Blackwood's fork as it moved from plate to mouth. Each movement felt like watching a car approach a cliff in slow motion. The grandfather clock in the corner struck 8, its deep chimes reverberating through the room. Tyler counted each strike, his heart matching their rhythm. 8 chimes, 8 chances to act, 8 reminders that time was running out. Mr. Blackwood raised his fork, the perfectly seasoned morsel of duck about to cross his lips. Tyler felt his body move before his mind could catch up. His grandmother's words about courage and doing the right thing propelled him forward. The moment of decision had arrived. "Don't eat that, sir." Tyler's voice cracked through the elegant atmosphere like a thunderbolt. The room froze. Wine glasses stopped midway to lips. Conversations died mid-sentence, and every head turned toward him. The silence that followed was deafening. Mr. Blackwood's fork hung suspended in the air, the fateful bite just inches from his mouth. His expression shifted from surprise to confusion as he stared at his young servant. "I beg your pardon." Tyler's heart hammered against his chest, but there was no turning back now. He stepped forward, aware of every eye in the room fixed on him. His work shoes squeaked against the polished floor, the sound impossibly loud in the stunned silence. "Your plate, sir." Tyler's voice shook, but he forced himself to continue. "It's been tampered with." He saw Mrs. Blackwood's face drain of color, her perfectly applied makeup now a mask over ashen skin. "Tampered with?" Mr. Blackwood's brow furrowed. "What exactly are you suggesting, young man?" Mrs. Blackwood recovered quickly, her shock transforming into calculated outrage. "This is absolutely ridiculous." She stood, her chair scraping against the floor. "Tyler, you're clearly unwell. Perhaps you should take the rest of the evening off." But Tyler stood his ground, though his knees threatened to buckle. "I saw it, sir. In the kitchen." His eyes met Mrs. Blackwood's fierce glare. "I saw Mrs. Blackwood put something in your food. A white powder from a small vial." The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Mr. Blackwood slowly lowered his fork, his face a study in conflicting emotions. He turned to his wife, searching her face. "Samantha, Richard, surely you don't believe this. This servant boy," her voice rose an octave, "this is preposterous. I would never." "Then you wouldn't mind if we had this plate tested?" Tyler suggested, surprising himself with his boldness. His grandmother would be proud, he thought, even as he watched Mrs. Blackwood's carefully constructed facade begin to crack. Mr. Blackwood's expression hardened as he observed his wife's reaction. Years of business dealings had taught him to read people, and something in his wife's demeanor must have triggered his suspicion. "Actually, that's an excellent suggestion." He gestured to the security guard stationed by the door. "Davis, please call the police, and make sure no one leaves this room." Mrs. Blackwood's composure shattered completely. "Richard, darling, you can't be serious. This boy is clearly lying. He's probably just trying to extort money from us. Or then you have nothing to fear from a simple test." Mr. Blackwood's voice was ice cold. He turned to Tyler, his eyes sharp. "Tell me everything you saw. Don't leave out a single detail." The dining room's elegant atmosphere had devolved into a scene of barely contained chaos. Security guards now stood at every exit, while Tyler, his voice steadier than he felt, recounted everything he'd witnessed in the kitchen. "She waited until Chef Marcus left," he explained, his hands clasped behind his back to hide their trembling. "She thought I'd left too, but I saw her reflection in the refrigerator door. The vial was small, crystal maybe, with a gold cap." Mrs. Blackwood's laugh cut through his testimony, but it held a note of hysteria. "This is absurd. Richard, you've known me for 15 years. Are you really going to believe some servant boy over your own wife?" 15 years, Mr. Blackwood repeated slowly, his voice heavy with realization. And in 15 years, I've never seen you this rattled, Samantha. He remained seated, his posture rigid, hands flat on the table. Where's your purse? The question hung in the air like a sword. Mrs. Blackwood's hand instinctively moved to clutch her bag closer. My purse. What does my purse have to do with anything? If there's no vial, there's no problem showing us, Mr. Morrison interjected, his business partner instincts kicking in. Clear your name right now, Samantha. The other guests watched in stunned silence, their own dinners forgotten. This was better than any society drama they'd gossip about later. Mrs. Chen had already discreetly pulled out her phone, no doubt texting her society friends. I don't have to prove anything. Mrs. Blackwood's voice rose, her carefully cultivated sophistication crumbling. This is my house. That boy, she jabbed a manicured finger at Tyler, is nothing but a liar who should be grateful we even employed him. Tyler stood straighter, drawing strength from his grandmother's teachings. Check the security cameras in the kitchen, sir. They'll show everything. Mrs. Blackwood's face went white. In her rage, she'd forgotten about the cameras Mr. Blackwood had installed last month. After some expensive wine went missing, the cameras, she whispered. Davis. Mr. Blackwood's voice was steady but deadly serious. Please escort my wife to her seat and retrieve her purse. He turned to another security guard. Johnson, get the security footage from the kitchen. All of it. Don't you dare touch me. Mrs. Blackwood shrieked as Davis approached. She backed away, clutching her purse like a shield. Richard, this is insane. I'm your wife. A wife who won't show me her purse, Mr. Blackwood observed coldly. A wife who's acting more guilty by the second. He stood slowly, his imposing figure commanding attention. Samantha, this is your last chance. Show us what's in your purse, or the police will do it for you when they arrive. The wail of distant sirens cut through the tension. Mrs. Blackwood's eyes darted to the windows, then the doors, calculating. The security guards moved closer. He's lying. Mrs. Blackwood's voice rose to a desperate pitch. This ungrateful boy has always been jealous of our lifestyle. He probably planned this whole thing to blackmail us. Her perfect composure had crumbled entirely, replaced by raw desperation. Tyler maintained his calm, though his heart raced. Mrs. Blackwood, I've never asked for anything but fair pay for honest work. Check the cameras. They'll show exactly what happened in that kitchen. Richard Blackwood sat in contemplative silence, his untouched plate before him. Years of business instincts had taught him to read people, and right now, everything about his wife's behavior screamed guilt. He turned to Tyler, studying the young man's steady gaze. You realize, Mr. Blackwood spoke carefully, that if you're lying, you're not just losing your job. This would be slander, criminal accusations. Your life would be effectively ruined. His eyes bored into Tyler's. Are you absolutely certain about what you saw? Yes, sir, Tyler replied without hesitation. My grandmother taught me that truth matters more than consequences. I know what I saw. The security officer returned with a tablet displaying the kitchen footage. Mr. Blackwood took it, his jaw tightening as he watched. The other guests craned their necks, trying to catch a glimpse of the screen. Mrs. Blackwood's demeanor shifted suddenly. Fine, you want to know the truth. Her voice took on a bitter edge. Look at what your precious business empire has done to us, Richard. When's the last time you came home for dinner? When's the last time you asked about my day? I'm just another acquisition to you, aren't I? Another trophy in your collection. The room fell silent. Mr. Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat, recognizing the brewing storm. He'd seen the Blackwoods' marriage deteriorating over the past year, but had stayed out of it. So you thought murder was the answer? Mr. Blackwood's voice was dangerously quiet. Poison me at my own dinner table. Murder? Mrs. Blackwood laughed hysterically. You want to talk about murder? What about the small businesses you've destroyed? The lives you've ruined with your hostile takeovers? The families left bankrupt because of your business strategies? She spat the words like venom. Tyler watched the exchange, realizing the depth of dysfunction beneath the mansion's perfect exterior. The arriving police sirens grew louder, and Mrs. Blackwood's face contorted with a mix of fear and defiance. That boy, she pointed at Tyler again, her hand shaking, has no idea what it's like to live with a man who loves his money more than his wife. He doesn't understand what it's like to be invisible in your own home. The police sirens reached their crescendo as two officers entered the dining room, their presence shattering the last remnants of the evening's elegance. Mr. Blackwood rose from his chair, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Officers," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "I'd like to report an attempted murder." He gestured to the untouched plate before him. "My wife tried to poison me tonight." Mrs. Blackwood's composure cracked completely. She lunged for her purse, which Davis, the security guard, had been holding. In the ensuing scramble, the bag fell, spilling its contents across the polished floor. Among the scattered lipsticks and credit cards, a small crystal vial with a gold cap rolled beneath the table. An officer quickly retrieved it, holding it up to the light. "Ma'am, please step away from the table. You don't understand." Mrs. Blackwood's voice cracked. "He deserved it. Do you know what he did to the Morrisons, to the Hendersons, all those families?" She turned to her husband's business partner. "James, tell them what really happened to David Henderson after Richard took his company." Mr. Morrison looked away uncomfortably, suddenly finding his water glass fascinating. The other guests sat frozen, witnessing the implosion of one of New York's most prominent couples. Mrs. Blackwood, the older officer, stepped forward. "Please, place your hands behind your back." She backed away, her designer dress catching on a chair. "Richard, please." Her voice changed, becoming soft, pleading. "We can work this out. Think about the scandal, what this will do to the company's reputation." Mr. Blackwood stood impassively, years of practiced boardroom control evident in his stance. "The company will survive. It always does." His eyes were cold. "Officer, you'll find security footage from our kitchen cameras. Tyler here witnessed everything." Tyler stepped forward when beckoned by the police, his voice clear as he recounted what he'd seen for the third time. The younger officer took notes while his partner kept a careful eye on Mrs. Blackwood. The other guests began to whisper among themselves, their phones discreetly capturing snippets of the scene. Tomorrow's society pages would be explosive. Mrs. Chen had already stepped into the hallway, presumably calling her contacts at the major newspapers. Mrs. Blackwood watched it all unravel, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her designer heels. Her eyes darted from face to face, finding no allies among the dinner guests who had praised her hospitality just hours before. "You want to talk about truth?" Mrs. Blackwood's voice took on a desperate edge as the officers approached her. "Let's tell them about the Henderson acquisition, Richard. Tell them how you knew David Henderson's wife was dying of cancer, how you waited until they were drowning in medical bills before you swooped in with your generous offer." Mr. Blackwood's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Some of the dinner guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact. "Or should we discuss the Peterson deal?" she continued, her words rushing out like a burst dam. "How many jobs were lost after that takeover? How many families lost their homes? But that doesn't matter to the great Richard Blackwood, does it? As long as the profit margins look good." Tyler stood quietly, watching the layers of deception peel away. The perfect power couple, the charitable socialite wife, the respected businessman, all facades crumbling under the weight of truth. Mrs. Blackwood, the older officer, interrupted firmly. "We need to take you to the station now." "I did it for them," she shouted, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "For all the people you've destroyed with your ruthless business practices. Someone had to stop you." Mr. Blackwood finally spoke, his voice cold. "So you appointed yourself judge, jury, and executioner. Was this before or after you spent $50,000 on that trip to Paris last month?" The younger officer began reading Mrs. Blackwood her rights while his partner carefully bagged the crystal vial as evidence. The other dinner guests watched in shocked silence as handcuffs were placed around her delicate wrists. "Richard," she tried one last time, her voice breaking. "Everything I did, every party I threw, every charity I supported, it was all to make you look good, to hide what you really are. And this is how you repay me." Mr. Blackwood turned away from her, addressing the officers. "You'll have my full cooperation in this investigation. My security team will provide all necessary footage and evidence." Tyler watched Mrs. Blackwood's face contort with hatred as she was led toward the door. She stopped briefly beside him. "You," she hissed. "You're just like him, pretending to be moral while serving the corrupt. How does it feel to be his latest puppet?" The elegant dining room, now a crime scene, buzzed with police activity. Officers collected evidence, while shell-shocked guests provided statements. Mr. Blackwood stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the city lights, as he spoke quietly with his lawyers on the phone. "We'll need your formal statement," an officer told Tyler, who nodded calmly. The initial adrenaline had worn off, leaving him exhausted but certain he'd done the right thing. As the police finished gathering evidence and the last curious guests departed, Mr. Blackwood approached Tyler. The room had emptied except for a few officers and security personnel. "You saved my life tonight," Mr. Blackwood said simply, his businessman's facade finally showing cracks of genuine emotion. Not many people would have had the courage to speak up. Tyler straightened his shoulders. "My grandmother always says character reveals itself in moments of crisis, sir." "Wise woman," Mr. Blackwood nodded. "And your grandmother was also right about what Samantha said." He paused, looking troubled. "I've made choices in business, harsh choices. Perhaps this is a wake-up call in more ways than one." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. "I want you to come see me in my office tomorrow, not as a servant, but as someone who's shown more integrity than most people I deal with daily. I think it's time I invested in people rather than just profits." The next morning, newspapers across New York blazed with headlines about the scandal. But in a small apartment across town, Tyler sat with his grandmother at their kitchen table, sharing breakfast before his meeting. "I'm proud of you, baby," she said, squeezing his hand. "Standing up for what's right isn't easy, especially when it costs you something." "Actually," Tyler smiled, holding up Mr. Blackwood's card, "Mr. Blackwood offered to pay for my college education. He says he wants to start a foundation for underprivileged students, and he'd like me to help run it while I study." His grandmother's eyes welled with tears. "See, good things come to those who do right, even when it's hard." Later that day, as Tyler walked into Blackwood Tower wearing a new suit instead of his servant's uniform, he reflected on how life could change in an instant. One moment of courage had not only saved a life, but had opened doors he never thought possible. In his office, Mr. Blackwood was already drafting plans for the foundation, determined to balance his karmic scales. The headlines would eventually fade, but the lessons learned that night about courage, integrity, and redemption would endure. And somewhere in a holding cell, wearing prison orange instead of designer clothes, Samantha Blackwood learned the hardest lesson of all. Revenge, like poison, often destroys the vessel that carries it. Tyler's grandmother had been right all along. Character doesn't just reveal itself in moments of crisis. It's built in those moments, one difficult choice at a time. The end.